Okay, you're listening to Touchless Beasts. My name is Jonah Hackinson, of course, and today I wanted to talk about inflation and market austerity. The term market austerity is something I just made up to describe our situation. In the past, things like recessions, downturns, and so on have gotten fancy names like capital strike, stagflation, you know. This is kind of involves those things, but it's a little more because of how the reconfiguration is going. And this is complicated. But inflation is just an increase in prices. The business owners decide on the price. They have a legal right to do so, barring government constraints, and they certainly do so in the United States. This is the cornerstone of private enterprise and free market. If those with an exclusive right to the profit of a business, the owners, raise prices, it could be for a variety of reasons. At the end of this very long day, though, the decisions made are predictably about retaining and growing profits. It's possible that a pre-pandemic labor crunch, which was already threatening production capacity reduction, coupled with a weak real demand, spun off from the pandemic, is the cause of the current inflation across the board. It's easy to spot the pent-up demand, but it's even easier to spot the bleeding inflation, the CPI increase, driving consumer spending, which is the personal consumption expenditures, or the personal outlays. If we look at both of them side by side, you can see it. And if you look at the blog post attached to this stuff, if you read it, you can see it. It's easy to see that, for example, a change from 15 trillion to 17 trillion in a year in the PCE is certainly driven by the introduction of an 8.5% inflation over the same period. The inflation adds a new accelerating coefficient to the resumption of normal growth in consumer outlays, making the personal consumption expenditures in the last year mostly driven not by pent-up demand, but by ballooning prices. Okay. So you measure consumer spending in dollars, not in how much stuff people are buying. Okay. It's hard to blame the inflation solely on a supposed supercharged average consumer spending and growing household outlays. We do know that after being concerning and waning, for example, right, credit card debt has been back on the rise over the last year. Although delinquencies remain low for the time being, it is important to note that growing payrolls in dollar amounts followed inflation, right? Instead of leading inflation, as was the case, let's say, in the 1970s, an overall increase in wages of about 5.2% year over year, which is what we're looking at now, 5.2% from last year, is also not an increase for everyone. Certain sectors and types of jobs saw pay increases higher than that. Others saw little to no effective change at all. This figure may not even consider that some workers, like those at Amazon warehouses or Trader Joe's, for example, who saw an increase in special pandemic pay that was eventually rolled back to their pre-pandemic punitive rates as inflation was ramping up. I might not consider that. So that's right, many employees, not just those places, not just those places. Many employees were treated like that. While their employing firms were raking in record profits. It shouldn't be much of a surprise that workers at both Trader Joe's and Amazon have seen unionization efforts. Now, in the case of Trader Joe's, that's rather recent, and I think it has something to do with Trader Joe's in Massachusetts. It's one or two locations or something. But again, in Amazon's case, it's only been one or two. But nevertheless, in one case, it's been successful. And of course, in the case of Starbucks, I think you could probably add this on there. Also, this kind of wage increase still doesn't consider the wage gap, where compensation for non-supervisory labor has not kept up with the 3.5% sanity check since about 2009. And again, if you look in there, there's some stuff from Economic Policy Institute. And this has to do with them saying that basically wages should have been growing about 3.5% this whole time because of the fact that there's a target for that. Basically, nominal wage growth. The idea being, if you take the Federal Reserve Board's 2% inflation target, it's 1.5% productivity growth and a stable labor share of income. What would have happened is at 3.5%, things would have been very different. But of course, as things settled out after 2009, what happens is a wage gap. So people have been making considerably less than what they should be, even with inflation and productivity growth during that time. And you can look at the part in the blog post that explains. There's a lot of charts in this one. Well, more than normal. So there's a wage gap that's been old too. So the problem with blaming wage increases, in my opinion anyway, which followed inflation, didn't lead it, is that even if this wage dollar amount increase was applied to everyone equally, it still represents a net decline in real wages, in real wage value, due to its diminished purchasing power under an 8.6% inflation over the last year. So you can't say that a 5.2% increase, even if it was overall applied equally, would translate to an increase, especially considering it's following inflation. It's not ahead of it. That's why those numbers are different. Okay. So it's not, you can't blame wages, you can't blame wage increases. They're the things that follow behind the price increases. Okay. So before the pandemic, the U.S. economy had more job openings than hires every month for several years. And quits, separations were relatively normal. They basically tightly coupled with the rate of hiring. The increase in separations would only make sense when there are more job openings than hires, and the hires and separations track closely together during that time. And why is that? Well, because most businesses don't post jobs based on the available labor force. They don't know what it is, right? They post jobs to fulfill next quarter's imagined growth in most cases. It's probably common sense, but it helps to point out that the job opening survey numbers only measure sort of a perceived demand for labor that firms are seeking outside of their company. This has nothing to do with internal hiring. We could have realized, though, that major sector firms were in need of labor. That simply didn't exist. It would look like that on paper. That should be a concern. However, there is a problematic notion among the business community, which has been griping about this for over a decade, that they cannot expect as much from the millennials or those younger in the labor force simply due to their lack of experience and quantity of available participation. In other words, it seems like there aren't very many of them, which is not really true. Which is more disrupted in younger cohorts, for example, due to the shifting sands they present in these times. So you kind of read the business press over the last, decade. The general hand-wringing went from worry to dismissal. Really, they post a lot of openings. They weren't hiring very much because they weren't finding the right kinds of people that wanted to work for them. People started wanting more money and they weren't going to pay it. That was part of it. The other part is millennials just fundamentally, certain age cohort here wasn't treated as valuable in the labor market. You're going to need a whole bunch of experience. This actually got worse as I got older. When I was first entering the job market, I'm like a geriatric millennial. I was born in 1980. Right? When I was entering the job market, as it were, the labor force, when I was participating in it, you didn't see the weirdness that I saw later. There wasn't an entry-level position that asked about anything about college education in any sector, really. I mean, and then it became like really common for certain things, like preferences for college degrees and things. I mean, really strange. And that just sort of kept going as this thing became more common. So that's standard gripe, though, about millennials don't want to work, or they're too complicated in the labor force to deal with, or, whatever. That standard gripe, it fails to show up in the numbers outside of defying the previous trend in recent years. The labor force participation rate decline over the last 25 years had a lot to do with retirees, and likely due to younger folks had stopped declining and began increasing in the few years between 2015 and 2019. As one might expect, as demand for labor was statistically higher than the labor force could physically meet, unemployment headed down steadily to 3.5% in February of 2020, the lowest since the mid-1960s. But of course, it had been trending down for several years, since 2015, rapidly. Unemployment was just going down and down and down. But then again, those are the U1 numbers, and that's, a vague assessment. You can double it if you want to get the real unemployment. At least you can double it. And the labor force participation rate began growing for the first time in 20 years. Now, this is important. What actually happens around 2015, 2016 is this neat thing. Inside of about a year there, by 2017, millennials are going to be the generation that is the majority in the labor force. And that did happen in 2017. Retirements slowing down. There's like kind of tapering off scenario. And it looks like labor force participation rate is not just flatlining like it does sometimes, but it actually is starting to go up, which is good. All right. But you and I, if we're not suffering from amnesia, can recall the countless stories and quips from 2015 on, or even earlier, about how people, especially younger folks anyway, just don't want to work. Well, it is likely very true that people didn't like their employment situations, and something like 70% of workers in the U.S. have job dissatisfaction of some kind. It's harder to say that they weren't working, though. The numbers simply don't show that to be the case. Right? An uptick in the labor force participation rate, not a stagnation, an uptick, at least for a solid year. So small but important. Starts small. They're exponential usually. Small uptick in that, coupled with record low unemployment. This isn't being done by old people. This is being done by younger people who are taking up a lot of slack in that situation. Not good jobs. Most of these people don't get good jobs, but they're working nonetheless. So the numbers don't show a problem there. It shows things getting better, actually. Labor organizing now, for example, seems to be primarily focused on transforming jobs worth quitting into jobs worth keeping, which is a reawakening of core principles of labor unions not seen since the 1930s and 40s, and marks a change from specialized labor union messaging in favor of a broadened solidarity among labor in traditionally high turnover jobs. This is something you can find from some of the rhetoric from recent organizing efforts and strikes and so on has mostly been not just the formation of the new unions in certain cases in high turnover jobs that are not expected or designed to be career jobs or not supposed to sustain you. They're not treated like that. And people in them want them to be treated like that because they know that these are the kinds of jobs they can get. And so instead of having jobs worth quitting, you might as well have a job worth keeping. and that is a unusual situation. What we can see is that even before the pandemic, though, major firms had an expectation and shareholder satisfaction vision that required a labor force that simply didn't exist, too. So that's another problem. After the pandemic shock and its attendant explosion in retirements, okay, it's people over 55 are your biggest problem. They ain't coming back. And they left in droves. The labor force participation rate, after making a very rapid and expected recovery, is now unpredictably too low. It's about 4.5 million folks simply stopped participating, and over half of that are excess retirements. That's the unexpected ones, right? They're too early. They're not fully into their Social Security or even before they're eligible. The other part is a combination of normal retirements and rolling business, higher quit churn, for example, due to the fact that there has been something like 2 jobs for every unemployed person for several months. I mean, this guy, you can trace this back to August of last year, I think. So yeah, almost a year of that. The few dollars in expanded unemployment that ended last summer, stimulus checks we haven't seen since last spring, and the now defunct child tax credit cash advances have almost no correlated feature in consumer behavior based on the dollars distributed, other than some brief period. This is kind of I think after the second round of checks, then some brief period of higher than normal consumer debt payments. No joke, people were paying their credit card debt way down with that money. You can read it. I have a link in there for this, actually. Now credit card indebtedness is on the rise again. And that's pretty tragic. And there's a ridiculously cheap money made available by the Fed to banks and their corporate borrowers, rolled in nearly $9 trillion all in, but let's say certainly the $120 billion per month from March of 2020 to March of 2022 that the Fed was creating by buying treasuries and mortgage bonds made money available to large firms that engaged heavily in stock buybacks to keep their asset value up. And now, instead of easing off the quantitative easing, the Fed simply hit the tightening into high gear, selling securities monthly at a rate almost 75% of the previous buy rate, effectively strangling money supply in the face of unprecedented rate hikes. All of this almost exclusively benefits the top 10% and, to an unprecedented degree, the notorious 1%. Supply chain disruptions, as you know, across East Asia and other regions has made critical factory line and production automation components very scarce. Talked about that before. And many suppliers on these components are over 9 months out still. I've talked about that before. And here's where I'm going to coin the term market austerity so you can understand what I mean. I use it to describe the planned loss of affordable variety in place of higher priced goods and services in need of rent or debt service, along with a labor force constrained to rising unemployment. This used to be called a capital strike back in the 80s, or sometimes stagflation. All of the major corporations understand that the labor supply is simply not there to create the output to grow their profits. So the trend is now to stop hiring, scale down production, limit outputs to high-margin, upmarket products and services, and raise prices to compensate for producing less. The next phase, already upon us in the tech sector, will be layoffs on top of hiring freezes in retail, then construction, and ultimately packaging, food processing, and banking. And if you listen to what I said on the last one, you get a taste of that. And the banking thing's already going on. The banking sector is already downsizing their mortgage divisions, and certain banks are already doing that. For example, it seems that certain cereal plants and likely other food processing will be focusing on their high-dollar, high-margin lines of products and scale down their other production. Of course, plenty of stories like this are leaking out from all kinds of businesses. A great deal of this has to do with capacity problems stemming from automation chip-dependent components and the labor situation. Again, other pieces mostly about that. The stock market is tanking for the usual interest of the wealthy to maintain and grow their wealth in things not dependent on consumer behavior and labor shortages. They move, and they are moving, from investing in working enterprises, see the downturn, and put that money instead into more stable securities with short yields. Inverted bond yield curves almost always go along with the first stages of deep, prolonged recessions, and we have seen this recently. If you look at the 2-year versus 10-year, 2-month, all that, and there's a link in there that you can follow. When the conditions in the economy improve for these businesses, there will be less competition and a buyer's market for labor and facilities. So in other words, right now, it's just no fun. So, the problem here is that this is happening, unfortunately, just at the time doors were finally opening wide to that younger labor force, with the possibility of necessary higher pay and benefits their suddenly retired predecessors enjoyed. Instead, this time is being used to scale down and shrink the overheated economy. It's understood by the Fed that some big dose of worker insecurity, which is something Alan Greenspan used to say back in the day, is needed before real growth can resume. The corporate boardrooms are frustrated with the U.S. worker that has unfortunately become too valuable, inflated, and is getting all these funny ideas about their situation. I would ask you to please follow this stuff closely and honestly, because the bamboozle is real. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the people that have been retiring, these baby boomers that have been retiring, they get their start in a superheated economy. But they got involved in that in inflation that was driven by their wages going up too much. And they got slapped in the 70s because there was a problem. But nevertheless, they got off on the right foot. That whole generation, overall, is going to be in pretty good shape. Not everybody in it was, of course, but overall. It has more savings, it has retirements, it has property, it has a lot of things. Way more expendable income, a lot less debt. I mean, it's just amazing if you look at that particular group of people born at that time in this country and what their prospects were versus the people that were born from 1980 until the mid-90s, right? I mean, you can't say that, people between mid-20s now to 40, one or whatever we're supposed to be now, millennials, totally different ballgame. And a lot of it has to do with the fact, the kinds of jobs they can get and what they pay. Labor productivity in the United States is crazy. What a business makes versus what it spends on labor is phenomenal in the United States because we've had wage suppression and stagnation forever. I mean, it's enough for you to live on, but that's the idea. Back in the day, up until the 70s, until the late 70s, compensation for non-supervisory employees, compensation always went up as productivity went up. It is a very close relationship. A lot of that was undergirded, as you can imagine, by labor. There were about 30% of the labor force in the United States was in a union in the 60s and early 70s. I mean, that was the case. It's the highest it's ever been in the private sector. And that put a lot of pressure on all the adjacent employers because they didn't want the union to show up. So it was understood you might as well just act like you have a union there. And that is when you see your profits growing with the same amount of labor, that's productivity increase, right? Your income from the business is getting pretty good, but you haven't hired any more people. What did labor do? Because they could only negotiate their contracts every 2 years. It was like, okay, I see what you guys are doing. Really raking in the profits there, aren't we, boss? Well, then you're going to pay us a little more too. What did your profits grow by? Oh, 4%, 5%, 10%, 20%. Cool. Then we need a 5%, 10%, 20% raise. And as you know, it's not the same amount of money, but this is a tight scenario. And now the compensation increases lag behind the productivity increases back then for a reason. But yeah, if you look at the numbers, that's the case. After World War II, that's just the case. Productivity of labor goes up, their wages go up. Until the end of the 70s, when productivity goes up and wages don't go up at all. Become completely decoupled in their value. To measure the productivity in inflation-adjusted dollars, and you measure wages with inflation-adjusted dollars. And you say, well, what is happening to wages? It'd be tragic for me to tell you that overall in your non-supervisory civilian capacity, as a wage worker in the United States, you're making basically the same in terms of its value as you would have been in 1978. This is why debt and poverty, if you can't get debt, you get poor, and that's what happens in the United States. That's a tragedy. That belongs almost exclusively to people who grew up and came of age in the early 2000s. We were entering a labor force that was woefully devalued compared to the profits that our labor generated. Where did the money come from? It comes from a lot of debt. Household debt. And by 1998, 99, 2000, somewhere in there, you know, household debt versus household incomes, and this is taking all the incomes and all the household debt, you know, hits 1 to 1, and then just keeps going the other way. I mean, it's like, you know, more household debt than income. I mean, across the country, and there's weird fluctuations here and there, as you can imagine. But that's a line we've crossed and haven't been able to go back over that. Because the idea of inflation is so scary. Wage-led inflation, how scary is that? Think about this like this. If the productivity is going on and all this money is going out to buy these things, let's say back in the 60s, 70s, this is what's going on, right? Inflation's going crazy because wages are leading the inflation. Because the union contracts and then the copycats that are going on, it's like, okay, we got to pay these people these cost of living increases. You know, we got to wait. Everybody's got to get a raise. And it's got to be tied to our profits. Otherwise, the union goes crazy. If our profit grows, if we grow our bottom line, they want their bottom line to grow too. Okay, so if you're making $10 an hour back then, which would be pretty decent money, if you're making $10 an hour back then, it's like, okay, I need like a 10% increase, or I'm going to make $11 an hour because the company went from making $10 million to $11 million. Okay, so you're going to go from making $10 to $11. You see? Overall, unless, you know, that's 1 million employees that they have to give that out to, they obviously came out ahead. Right? Okay. Their $1 million extra in profits that they got 2 years later that these people are going to ask for $1 raise. I mean, yeah, it's keeping up with inflation. It lags about 18 months behind the productivity increase. But like I said, unless you're a company with 1 million employees and everybody's getting $1 raise, obviously the business still is making the bigger gain there. But we're not looking in that. We're just looking at the rates of increase. Sure, the concern here really is that if people are doing this, can they save? No, the savings rate hadn't changed that much. It was about to kick into high gear. The idea was to get people to save and park their money in a bank and quit spending like crazy because they were driving the prices up. So this told you one thing that shouldn't have scared anybody is that the average working person, as they were making more money, they were banking some of it, but they were just spending more. which was, what was interesting? They kept them employed. This is why in the 60s, towards the end of the 60s, you had 3.24% unemployment. Like, we can't get until we dismantle the economy and pretend it's that. Back then, it was real. Very high labor force participation rate amongst men in the 60s was about the highest it's ever been in this country. The LFPR between 25 and 55-year-old men, which we call prime-age working men in this country, was 90%. It's like 82% or something now. This was an incredible time. This is across the board. Now, I'm not saying everybody was having a great time in the 60s, but there's in mid-60s into the early 70s, but people are definitely doing better. One of the things that happens when people see an accelerated quality of life and that kind of job stability and so on, people get pretty comfortable. And when there's an overall increase, you can notice the things that aren't improving. So poverty becomes really obvious. It becomes a major issue in the 60s. For the first time, it had been since the 30s. And which was kind of interesting. There was a whole war on poverty declared, This is a Johnson notion that he pushes and tries to. But you can understand why it was seen as an activist thing. It was seen as a minority concern, because really it's like poor people. Yeah, there were huge communities that were being completely left in the dust. You don't end up with the Black Panthers and their Rainbow Coalition in Chicago because everybody's doing better, right? Obviously not. That creates tensions. But there's all kinds of other stuff going on. The other stuff going on is because people are generally doing better. Now, there's this Vietnam War thing in there. That doesn't seem to fly with people. Not at first, it's okay, but at a certain point, no, it's the bane of everybody's existence. This is why you can't do a draft in the country anymore. It's like people know what that means. It's tragic. But everything else is totally the product of an overheated economy. Too many young people with decent jobs. Too many young people being able to afford to and go to college. Savings rate is better. There's a notion that at some point we're going to have to deal with this. And I don't think it's particularly surprising to me that the idea of attacking the system of wages keeping pace with profit growth, which was going on just because, and why, what happens? At the same time, the neoliberal agenda moves into place. We're going to financialize all the markets. We're going to start offshoring everything, break up the unions, and all of this stuff starts forming in our political apparatus here and in England, Western European countries, Canada, and to some degree in Mexico is thinking about some crazy austerity programs. Like, this is going on. At the same time, there's this wonderful publication that came out called The Crisis of Democracy. It was put together by the Trilateral Commission, and it was a blueprint. It was the plan written by a lot of people, but several of the authors of that from that group. It's like a trilateral world at the time. That the notion was Japan, North America, United States, basically, and Western Europe, and that they all could see this sort of failure of the institutions that were responsible for the indoctrination of the young, universities and church and other things, and then. There was a crisis of democracy. There were too many people feeling capable enough to press their demands. You had a very strong middle class. That's part of the reason why. I mean, what we would call a middle class, that original definition of it. And the business community, which needs people to fall in line with a program of respected capital ownership, and also a lack of interference from the rabble, the majority of the population, they didn't like the interference from that on what they were doing with the government. The capital owners in the United States set up the United States government to protect them. That's what your Constitution is all about. It's part of the reason it took a long time in reading it with a different pair of glasses to think that it was supposed to apply to everybody. That's tragic oversight by the Founding Fathers, I guess. That they wrote things down just vaguely enough that it could be reinterpreted as if it was supposed to apply to everybody. It certainly did not, and that's not why it was created. That had to be formed into that. I think that's part of the reason why most people don't really want to redo our Constitution, like most Western democracies, if you want to call them that, have done, for good or for ill. But in our case, like, we just won't touch it. And I think the reason is it's so conveniently vague. You know, the left and labor and the poor or whatever, anybody can use it. And so can the rich. I mean, the sad thing about it is it doesn't necessarily have any class determinations for one reason. It was put together by people who were all created equal. So there you go. Now, in that case, what we do understand, though, in the United States, there's a sentiment about equality. And I think what we're seeing in this labor shift is very real. And we should probably consider the political aspirations of some of the business operations as well. That, like, back then, when there was this concerted business community and political effort to defang labor and put people on debt peonage as a way to basically discipline the labor force without going to war. That's why you haven't had to do that kind of war thing for a while. And if you don't think that has anything to do with it, it's because the last time it was tried, it actually just made things worse. So it's like Vietnam, I think, was a total idea to somehow shackle the youth into a hatred of communism, which all they ended up doing was just hating their government for this kind of stupid thing. And then ever since then, the military just fills its ranks with robots and plus, you know, the cannon fodder that it needs. And I don't want to call people that, but you know what you signed up for. And you're probably fine in the United States military because we don't get involved in anything unless we're going to level the place or nobody's going to get hurt. We have ridiculously low casualty and injury rates compared to other countries, mostly because we shoot first and ask questions later. So in that case, that's our engagement. People aren't as interested in being in the military as they used to be, but there are people who will constantly fill its ranks. It's been understood by the Defense Department ever since the Afghanistan and then Iraq engagements that it was understood that people will fill the ranks. They don't have to do a draft. They'll never have to do a draft. And not that long ago, they said why. Again, let me take you back to something else that also came out of the 70s, at the end of the Vietnam War and all this other stuff. What else came out? Student loan debt. Yeah. And you know what? Not that long ago, I think this was like 2020, somewhere in there, some conversation about student debt relief for 2021. Wasn't that long ago. And it was somebody from Joint Chiefs, I think, that was testifying in Congress, had basically said something to the effect of, well, we don't have to worry about recruitment because our biggest recruiting tool that we have, the best one we have, is student debt. That's their biggest recruiting tool. And they're saying this in an honest way. I mean, it's true. All they have to do is tell people, hey, you don't have to worry about paying for college. You don't want some student debt? Just join up. That is them. It's a way the military says, I can get you into a decent job just by you going through this 4 years of this as opposed to 4 years of debt. Okay? That's a very real thing. And they could have said this at any time, but that's always been the case. Especially that it attracts the kinds of people that they want in it, too. Right? People right out of high school from poor communities where there's all kinds of other problems, and the person is more likely to be more compliant and probably more obedient and so on. Or maybe a pain in the ass. It doesn't really matter. But I would let you take a look into that if you want. And I know I might have offended a whole bunch of people, but I happen to been very, very close to that kind of operation before. So, and I used to be a civilian employee in the Air Force. So I was around people like this. So that being said, the bamboozle's real. It's very real.